Welcome back to the Retro Review, where history comes alive. Without wasting another moment, let's step back in time and explore the story of Alexander the Great. Let's begin. The son of a king. In the summer of the year 356 BC, in the Macedonian capital of Pella, a boy was born who would grow up to conquer more territory than any single person had ever conquered before him. His name was Alexander. His father was Philip II, King of Macedon, a shrewd and battle-hardened ruler who had spent years transforming a rough hill kingdom on the edge of the Greek world into the most powerful military state in the region. His mother was Olympias, a princess from Epirus, fiercely intelligent, deeply religious, and famous even in her own time for a temperament that most ancient writers described as passionate, willful, and impossible to control. From Olympias, Alexander seems to have inherited a sense of personal destiny bordering on the mystical. She claimed descent from the hero Achilles, and she encouraged stories that Alexander's true father was not Philip at all, but the god Zeus himself, who she said had visited her in the form of a serpent. Whether Alexander truly believed this, or simply found it a useful piece of political theater, he carried a lifelong sense that he was marked out for something beyond ordinary kingship. From his father, Alexander inherited something far more concrete, the finest army in the known world. Philip had spent 2 decades reforming Macedonian warfare, creating the famous Macedonian phalanx, a formation of infantrymen carrying the sarissa, an enormous pike nearly 20 feet long, along with a highly trained cavalry force known as the Companions. Philip had used this army to subdue Macedon's neighbors, and by the year 338 BC, to defeat a combined army of Athens and Thebes at the Battle of Chaeronea, effectively making himself the master of mainland Greece. When Alexander was 13 years old, Philip made a decision that would shape the intellectual life of his son forever. He hired the philosopher Aristotle, then one of the most brilliant minds in the Greek world, to tutor the young prince. For several years, Alexander studied under Aristotle at a place called the Nymphaeum of Mieza, learning philosophy, medicine, science, and above all, a deep love of Homer's Iliad, which Alexander reportedly kept beneath his pillow for the rest of his life, along with a dagger. He saw himself quite consciously as a second Achilles, destined for glory and for an early, legendary death. Alexander also received an education in horsemanship that produced one of history's most famous animal companions. As a boy, he is said to have tamed a wild, unmanageable horse that no one else in his father's court could control, a black stallion named Bucephalus, meaning ox head, for the shape of its face. Alexander noticed the horse was afraid of its own shadow, and simply turned it to face the sun. Philip, watching his young son succeed where grown men had failed, is said to have told him that Macedon was too small a kingdom for him, and that he would need to find a larger one. Bucephalus would carry Alexander through most of his major campaigns for the next 2 decades. In 336 BC, Philip II was assassinated at the wedding of his daughter, stabbed by one of his own bodyguards, a man named Pausanias, under circumstances that remain debated by historians to this day. Some ancient sources hint that Olympias, or even Alexander himself, may have had some knowledge of the plot, though this has never been proven and many modern historians consider it unlikely. What is certain is that Alexander, only 20 years old, was proclaimed king of Macedon almost immediately, and moved with ruthless speed to eliminate potential rivals to his throne before they could challenge him. Alexander inherited not just a kingdom, but a mission his father had already begun planning. A war of vengeance and conquest against the Persian Empire, the vast superpower that stretched from Asia Minor all the way to the borders of India. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander crossed the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia, at the head of an army of roughly 40,000 men. According to legend, as his ship neared the Asian shore, Alexander hurled a spear into the sand and declared he was taking Asia as spear-won land, a gift from the gods. His first major battle came quickly, at the Granicus River, where he defeated a Persian force in a fierce cavalry engagement, personally leading the charge and reportedly nearly losing his life, when a Persian nobleman's blade was stopped only by the intervention of one of his officers, Clytus, who cut the man down just before the blow landed. It was an early sign of the reckless personal courage, bordering on the suicidal, that would define Alexander's leadership throughout his career. He fought at the front of his men, not safely behind the lines, and this won him fierce loyalty, even as it repeatedly put his life at risk. The decisive early confrontation came at Issus in 333 BC, where Alexander faced the Persian king himself, Darius III, in person. Despite being significantly outnumbered, Alexander's tactical brilliance and the discipline of his phalanx broke the Persian lines, and Darius fled the battlefield, abandoning his own mother, wife, and children, who were captured by the Macedonians. Alexander treated the royal family with notable respect and courtesy, a decision that was as much a political calculation as an act of chivalry, designed to present himself as a legitimate successor to the Persian throne rather than a mere barbarian invader. Rather than chase Darius immediately, Alexander turned south along the Mediterranean coast, methodically securing the port cities that could otherwise have served as bases for the still powerful Persian navy. The city of Tyre, built on an island fortress and considered nearly impregnable, resisted him for 7 grueling months. Alexander's engineers built a massive causeway out into the sea to reach the walls, and when the city finally fell in 332 BC, Alexander, furious at the long resistance and the killing of his envoys, allowed a brutal sack of the city. From there, Alexander marched into Egypt, where he was welcomed not as a conqueror, but almost as a liberator from Persian rule, and the Egyptian priesthood crowned him pharaoh. It was here, in the Egyptian desert, that Alexander made a long and dangerous pilgrimage to the oracle of the god Amun at the Siwa oasis. What was said to him there was never fully revealed, but he emerged from the encounter apparently convinced, or at least willing to let others believe, that he was the son of Amun, a divine figure in a way that went beyond ordinary Macedonian kingship. While in Egypt, he also founded a city at the mouth of the Nile that he named after himself, Alexandria, which would go on to become one of the greatest centers of learning in the ancient world. In 331 BC, Alexander turned east again to hunt down Darius and finish the conquest of Persia once and for all. The two kings met for a final decisive battle near the village of Gaugamela, in what is now northern Iraq. Darius commanded a truly enormous army, reinforced with scythed chariots and war elephants, vastly outnumbering Alexander's forces. Though ancient figures for the exact size of the Persian army are almost certainly exaggerated by ancient historians. Through superior tactics, discipline, and a bold, almost reckless cavalry charge aimed directly at Darius's own position, Alexander shattered the Persian center. Darius fled the field once again, and this time his authority as King of Kings was effectively finished. He was murdered not long afterward by his own satrap, Bessus, who attempted to claim the Persian throne for himself. With Darius dead, Alexander proclaimed himself the rightful king of Persia, and pursued Bessus deep into Central Asia, through territories that are today Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. Campaigns of extraordinary difficulty across mountains and deserts that tested his army to its limits. It was during this phase of the campaign that Alexander began to adopt elements of Persian royal dress and court customs, including a ceremonial bow called proskynesis, a gesture of prostration that deeply offended many of his Macedonian and Greek officers, who felt Alexander was abandoning his roots and elevating himself to a godlike status they were not willing to grant him. This growing tension between Alexander and his own senior officers led to some of the darkest moments of his life. At a drunken banquet in Samarkand in 328 BC, Alexander quarreled violently with Clitus, the very officer who had once saved his life at the Granicus River. In a fit of rage, Alexander killed Clitus with a spear, and was reportedly consumed by grief and remorse for days afterward, refusing to eat or speak. Around the same period, Alexander uncovered and brutally crushed a conspiracy among his own pages, and executed his general Philotas, along with Philotas's father, the elderly and highly respected commander Parmenion, one of Philip's original generals, and a man who had served the Macedonian crown for decades, on suspicion of treason. In the midst of these harsh years in Central Asia, Alexander married Roxana, the daughter of a local nobleman in Bactria, said by ancient writers to be a woman of remarkable beauty, in what was likely both a genuine romantic attachment and a calculated political marriage designed to secure the loyalty of the region's elites. By 327 BC, having conquered the entire Persian Empire, Alexander could have turned home. Instead, he pushed onward into India, driven by a restless ambition that seemed to have no natural limit. In 326 BC, he fought his final great pitched battle at the Hydaspes River against the Indian king Porus, whose forces included a formidable line of war elephants, a weapon Alexander's army had never faced in such numbers before. It was a hard-fought and costly victory, and Alexander was reportedly so impressed by Porus's courage in battle that, rather than deposing him, he restored him as a ruler under Macedonian authority, and the two men are said to have formed a genuine mutual respect. It was also near the Hydaspes that Alexander's beloved horse Bucephalus died, either from wounds or simply from old age, having carried the king for the better part of 20 years across most of the known world. Alexander founded a city on the site, and named it Bucephala in the horse's honor, a rare and telling act of sentiment from a man usually consumed by conquest. Alexander's army, however, had reached its breaking point. After 8 years of continuous campaigning, thousands of miles from home, exhausted, homesick, and facing the prospect of even more warfare against the powerful kingdoms of the Ganges plain, his soldiers refused to go any further. At the Hydaspes River, Alexander's own men, the very Macedonians who had followed him since Greece, effectively mutinied, and after days of trying to persuade them, Alexander was forced, for the first time in his life, to accept defeat not on a battlefield, but against his own exhausted army, he agreed to turn back. The return journey was almost as costly as any battle he had fought. Alexander led a portion of his army through the Gedrosian Desert, a punishing stretch of terrain in modern-day southern Iran and Pakistan, and the march claimed the lives of a staggering number of soldiers and camp followers, weakened by heat, thirst, and starvation, in what many historians consider one of the most needless disasters of Alexander's entire career. Alexander eventually returned to the heart of his new empire, settling for a time in the ancient city of Babylon. There he began planning even more ambitious campaigns, including a proposed invasion of Arabia, while also working to integrate his sprawling multi-ethnic empire, encouraging intermarriage between his Macedonian officers and Persian noblewomen in a mass wedding ceremony at Susa, and incorporating Persian soldiers into his previously all-Macedonian army. In 324 BC, Alexander suffered a devastating personal loss when his closest companion, Hephaestion, a man who had been his friend since childhood, and whom many ancient sources strongly suggest was also his lover, died suddenly of illness in the city of Ecbatana. Alexander's grief was described by ancient historians as extreme and almost unhinged, reportedly ordering the physician who had treated Hephaestion executed, and commissioning an enormous and lavishly expensive funeral in his honor. Alexander himself did not long survive his friend. In June of 323 BC in Babylon, Alexander fell seriously ill following a period of heavy feasting and drinking, and his condition rapidly worsened over roughly a week and a half, marked by high fever and increasing weakness. He died on either the 10th or 11th of June, 323 BC, at only 32 years old. The exact cause of his death has been debated by historians and physicians for more than 2,000 years, with theories ranging from malaria to typhoid fever to a bacterial infection to poisoning by rivals within his own court, though no theory has ever been definitively proven. Famously, when his generals asked the dying king to whom he left his vast empire, Alexander is said to have answered simply, "To the strongest," a final ambiguous statement that guaranteed decades of brutal warfare among his former generals, known as the Diadochi, who tore his empire apart and divided it among themselves in the years that followed his death. In the span of just 13 years as king, Alexander had built an empire stretching from Greece and Egypt in the west to the Indus River in the east, one of the largest empires the ancient world had ever seen, achieved through a combination of military genius, personal charisma, sheer physical courage, and an almost mythic self-belief that he was destined for something beyond ordinary human achievement. His conquests permanently reshaped the ancient world. Greek language, art, and culture spread across the Middle East, Egypt, and Central Asia in a wave historians call Hellenization, blending with local traditions to create new hybrid cultures that would last for centuries. The city of Alexandria in Egypt became, under his successors, one of the great intellectual capitals of the ancient world, home to its famous library. Trade routes opened between the Mediterranean world and Central Asia and India that would remain significant for generations. More than 2,000 years later, Alexander's name remains a byword for military genius and boundless ambition, studied by generals and historians alike. Remembered as the young king who set out from a small kingdom on the edge of the Greek world, and before his 33rd year, believed he had conquered nearly all of it. Alexander the Great's life lasted just 32 years. but his legacy has endured for more than 2,000. His conquests reshaped civilizations, spread cultures across continents, and changed the course of history forever. Thank you for joining us on the Retro Review. If you enjoyed this documentary, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another journey into the past. What do you think? Was Alexander the Great history's greatest military commander, or was his ambition simply too great? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and remember, every event has a story. Every decision has consequences. Every chapter of history shapes the world we live in today. We'll see you in the next chapter of history.